Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our Unit 16, which is on the 1960s, looking at Kennedy and Johnson, Nixon, and the Vietnam War. Looking at a review sheet here from top to bottom, starting with Betty Friedan, 1963, she writes The Feminine Mystique, which challenged the idea that a woman's fulfillment was ideally as a wife and a mother, and Betty found herself, as well as others, dissatisfied with the condition they were in, saying that essentially they'd been indoctrinated in brainwashing by men, that they were supposed to fill men's expectations by being moms and mothers, and this is being done through education and culture, and it's considered to be the feminist manifesto. Michael Harrington, The Other America, Its Influence. Well, Michael Harrington is a democratic socialist, and he does a study of poverty in America. And he says that even though the middle class is expanding and we're having this economic boom, which starts in the post-war period in the 50s, that about 20% of Americans are living in grinding poverty. And these are those in the urban slums, those in the rural South, those in Appalachia. And this book is going to be an influence on the Democrats who will control the White House and the Congress in the mid-1960s, and it's going to lead into LBJ's Great Society. More on that later. Another writer to be familiar with, Rachel Carson, and her book Silent Spring, and this is an environmentalist manifesto. 1960, she's writing about the effects of pesticides on the environment. And Silent Spring refers to this spring where there's no birds chirping because the eggshells have been damaged by pesticides that have moved up the food chain, and these eggs don't hatch. And it's a story about the destructiveness of industrialization and toxic waste on the environment. The American Indian Movement, AIM, is one of those movements, one of these groups, the Native Americans, that's being influenced by the civil rights movement. And the leader is Russell Means. And what is the AIM wants is justice for the Indians. They want the return of lands that have been promised in broken treaties. They want restitution. They want justice. They want greater self-government. And this is going to take place over the next decades. And some things that AIM does to gain attention. They take over the island of Alcatraz. Of course, the prison is shut down here, but they take over the island. They take over Mount Rushmore for a day. They occupy the town of Wounded Knee for 71 days, and ultimately there's a shootout. 2 Indians are killed here. The UFW is the United Farm Workers, and this is an organization union led by Cesar Chavez, and it is going to strike at various produce farms, most famously boycotting grapes. So at one point, you were supposed to not drink wine, you're not supposed or eat grapes that have been picked by migrant labor. And what's going to happen here is that this union will gain recognition, and we'll get more pay, and we'll get more safety, safe conditions such as wash stations and things like that out in the fields. And Cesar Chavez is this Chicano activist. Chicanos are the specific name for Mexican Americans. The EPA, you should be familiar, this is one of these movements that comes out of, one of these organizations or agencies that comes out of the environmentalist movement in 1970. Nixon will sign this into law, and this isn't what it says. It's supposed to protect the environment. It has that mandate. Remember, Nixon is sort of a moderate Republican, so he signs off on this. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, sometimes nicknamed the Immigration Reform Act, is going to see the end of that quota system that was set up by the 1924 National Origins Act. And it's going to focus on letting people in who have skills. It's going to be race and nation blind here, and it's going to focus on restoring family relationships, bringing in wives and children and parents of families. The Great Society. The Great Society is this vision of a society with no more poverty. In fact, one of the nicknames of this is the War on Poverty, and this comes from a speech that Johnson gives at the University of Michigan, where he says we can build a great society. Goals here are to defeat poverty, to protect consumers, to protect the environment, to aid education, and to protect civil rights. Regarding civil rights, some things that take place in the 60s to just take note of here. You have the Woolworth lunch counter sit-ins that start in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, and this is part of this nonviolent civil disobedience coming out of the work of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and one of the main leaders there is Martin Luther King Jr. And this sit-in is going to spread through the South. It's going to be organized by the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, and eventually 70,000 sit-ins or people involved in sit-ins will do this as civil disobedience in the 1960s. You have your Freedom Riders, 1961, testing their activists, testing a Supreme Court decision that says you cannot have segregation on interstate travel. And there's that famous attack on one of these buses that stopped and firebombed in Anniston, Alabama. The March on Washington, 1963, you have on the mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King gives this speech, the I Have a Dream speech, and basically this march is a demand for civil rights. In the following year, 1964, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 signed into law by President LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, that ends segregation in public places on the basis of race, color, religion, ethnicity, or national origin. In Selma, you have a famous march in 1965, and this is going to be a bunch of black activists, a bunch of black citizens here who are protesting their exclusion from the voting rolls. So even though they're the majority of the county, very small number of them are registered, and the goal here is to, as they cross the Pettus Bridge, maybe some of you have seen some of this video footage, they are beaten and they're tear gassed. And if you look at the marchers, they're not blocking the street. They're wearing suits and ties and nice hats, and they're on the sidewalk crossing the bridge, but they're beaten anyhow. This is going to lead later to a larger march of 25,000, which will be protected by the National Guard, which is called out by the president, and U.S. Marshals are going to protect them, and they're going to make it to Montgomery. The original attack on the marchers sometimes is called Bloody Sunday. The Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968, when he's running for president, sometimes this is also called the white backlash. And the idea here is that instead of emphasizing race, that you're going to use trigger words, you're going to use code words, and rather than criticize the Great Society and the Democrats doing all the civil rights work, you're going to criticize government interference in state rights. You're going to criticize big government. You're going to criticize welfare. You're going to criticize bureaucracy and crime and drugs, which supposedly are out of control here under the Democrats. And some people believe this is code word. It's bait for racists. And of course, that's, if you're more cynical and more liberal. But if you're conservative, there is a feeling that things have spun out of control in the United States in the late 60s, which will lead to the successful election here of Nixon. And Nixon's going to flip the South, that solid South, which for approximately 100 years is voting Democratic, is going to start voting conservative, is going to start voting for the Republicans. Looking at some overseas, some foreign affairs things to take note of. You have the Bay of Pigs invasion, which is planned under Eisenhower, but is executed during the Kennedy administration, and it is an invasion supported by the United States government of anti-Castro, anti-communist Cuban rebels, which they're going to be found out when they land on the beach in southern Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. A bunch of them are going to be killed, some of them wounded, and over 1,000 are going to be captured. And this is going to give Khrushchev the belief that the president, who Kennedy does not send in, he doesn't give these people air support, does not give them U.S. military support, and this anti-communist invasion is crushed. Khrushchev thinks that Kennedy is weak, and this is going to lead Khrushchev in 1961 to build, along with these Germans, to build this wall. And under I believe it's the Potsdam Agreement, that the four sides here, the French, Brits, Americans, and the Russians, aren't supposed to put any impediment to movement around the city of Berlin. But the Russians break this agreement. They put a wall because East Germany is hemorrhaging. They're hemorrhaging citizens who are fleeing, and they're fleeing. If you can make it to East Berlin, you can make it to West Berlin and into West Germany. And something like 20-25% of the population of Germany is going to flee before the wall is built. And this is eventually going to lead to this 1963 Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner speech by Kennedy, who stands in front of the wall. And this wall is metaphorically, it's part of that Iron Curtain dividing the free world from the communist world, that Berlin becomes an island of freedom amidst a wave of tyranny, which the United States and its allies are containing. The containment theory in Southeast Asia. Remember, containment comes from George Kennan, our ambassador to Moscow. It's this warning that the Soviets are duplicitous, they're liars, they are dangerous, they're aggressive, and all they understand is force. So we need to have alliances, we need to have soldiers in Europe, we need to protect the free world from communism. And you see this in the 1950s in Asia and Korea, and you see this in Southeast Asia with the Americans supporting the government of Laos, which is fighting a communist guerrilla movement, but we also support the French from 45 to 54 as they fight against the communists in Vietnam. And when the French leave after losing the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, we are going to support the South Vietnamese government. We're going to resist elections which supposedly were supposed to be held after the Geneva Agreement where the French got out. And the thinking here is there will be no free elections in North Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader, is popular in the South because he's a nationalist. He basically fought the Japanese, fought the French, and the fear is that he's going to sort of trick the Vietnamese people into allowing communism to take over the country. So we become involved in containment in Vietnam, and this is going to lead into escalation after the Gulf of Tonkin incident into tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fighting in Vietnam. And the escalation takes place after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which in '64 is an attack by the North Vietnamese on American surveillance ships off the North Vietnamese coast. And this is going to lead to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is permission by Congress to the President to protect our military and to resist communist aggression. And you'll hear it said that there is no declaration of war against the North Vietnamese, but this is essentially the equivalent. Congress giving permission, giving encouragement for the President to protect our forces and to stop the attack by North Vietnam on what we see as an act of aggression against South Vietnam. And you should be familiar with this idea of the domino theory. This is described by Eisenhower back in the 50s in a press conference in 1954. And it's this idea, if one country falls, other countries will fall as well. So we are not going to let the communists take Korea. We are not going to let the communists take South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, 1968, during the Vietnam New Year, you have an attack by about 80,000 North Vietnamese and Cong, and the Cong are the South Vietnamese communist rebels, on 100 Vietnamese cities and on the American embassy, which will be taken over temporarily in Saigon. The communists will take over the second largest city in Vietnam, up near the DMZ, which is the city of Hue, Hue. And the end here of the Tet Offensive is a rather decisive communist defeat. In the field, every place the communists took is taken back. But the Tet Offensive is seen as a psychological defeat for the United States. The American people have been told by the President, by the Pentagon, that we are winning the war, that this war of attrition, there's no way the communists can withstand the body count that is piling up. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and whether the military was lying, whether the President was wishful thinking or exaggerating, there is this feeling that we got to get out, that the war is unwinnable, and that we're not getting straight talk from the military or our government. And this brings us back to something I skipped over a little higher up on the review sheet, this idea of the silent majority. Nixon in 1968 is going to ask for support from this silent majority. And these are those people who are, they're not the hippies, they're not the counter-war protesters. These are the patriotic Americans who don't protest, who go to work, who pay their taxes, who aren't taking drugs, who aren't on welfare, who are law-abiding, flag-waving citizens, and he's asking for their support. And what's interesting in the Tet Offensive, there is a rather significant anti-war movement among young people, especially young guys who don't want to get drafted. But after Tet, the middle class is largely going to turn against this war as being a lost cause. The reason LBJ refuses to seek re-election is largely because of what sort of caps off here with the Tet Offensive, but that this war is not going well, and he suffers an almost loss to Eugene McCarthy, who's this is not Joseph McCarthy, that's a different guy, that's from Wisconsin. Eugene McCarthy is a peacenik. He is a candidate who's anti-war, who comes just within a few percentage points of beating Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. And an almost win is just about as bad as a loss. And LBJ is going to be hounded by protesters everywhere he goes. 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your effing war. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And LBJ one day gets on TV and he says he will not run, and if he's offered the nomination, he will not take it. And the person who will run and win the nomination and lose the election for the Democrats in '68 is his Vice President, Hubert Humphrey. And Nixon will win this election. We want somebody different at the helm. And Nixon's solution here is Vietnamization. And very simply, this is turning the war over to the South Vietnamese as we have a withdrawal, as we have a pull down of U.S. troops under Nixon. But not giving Nixon too much credit, half of the Americans who die in Vietnam are dying under his watch. So this withdrawal does take time, and there's some fierce fighting during the Nixon administration. Getting towards the end of our list here, Nixon and Watergate. What you need to know about Watergate is, they're the Committee to Re-elect the President, which has this crazy acronym, CREEP, has bugged the phones of the Democratic campaign headquarters in the Watergate, sort of a condominium hotel office complex in Washington, D.C., and they're found out. And the question is, who ordered this break-in, and how high up does it go? And although it was never proven that Nixon ordered this, he did find out, and he did. And we have these tapes, which are from his office, which he was eventually ordered to turn over to Congress by the Supreme Court. We have proof that the president ordered the FBI, ordered various government agencies to stonewall, to drag their feet, to not cooperate. And this is called obstruction of justice. There are 3 articles of impeachment which were drawn up by an investigating committee. Recommendation was to take these to the floor of the House for a official vote of impeachment, which is charges against the president, and he resigned before he could officially be charged. But the 3 articles of impeachment were obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. So the president does resign before he can be impeached and possibly convicted, although that does not happen. He resigns in 1974, which is an astonishing thing considering the incredible win he had in 1972 over George McGovern. And finally, some Supreme Court cases that expand civil rights. The Warren Court is known as an activist court, is known as a liberal court. So a few cases that come to mind. You have the Brown decision, striking down segregation in public schools. You have Roe v. Wade, giving a woman the right, reproductive rights of abortion. You have Baker versus Carr, which establishes the idea of one man, one vote, that when you divide districts in a state for voters, they have to be essentially the same in population. And what had happened was districts were being drawn with disregard for the black population in southern states, giving an advantage to the white electorate, which could disproportionately elect more white representatives. So one man, one vote. And Gideon versus Wainwright, and that's that case where Florida Khan successfully asked the Supreme Court that he should have a new trial because he didn't have a lawyer. So when you have a trial, you have a right to a lawyer under the Gideon versus Wainwright decision. And then you have Miranda versus Arizona. Your Miranda rights, these are the ones you see in movies and TV shows, that when the cops are arresting you, you have a right, you're told you have a right to a lawyer. And this is at the time of questioning, the time of interrogation, before you even have your trial. So all along the way, you have a right to legal representation, which will be given to you if you can't afford it. So some thoughts here on this unit on the 60s, on this test that's coming up. Look over the review sheet here, look over your notes, because If it's on the review sheet, it's going to be on the test. So signing out, study hard, good luck.